Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue with readings from Galactic Cluster, an anthology of science fiction stories by James Blish. This time we begin This Earth of Ours. The advance squadron was coming into line as Master Sergeant Oberholzer came onto the bridge of the Nove Washington Grad, saluted, and stood stiffly to the left of Lieutenant Campion, the exec, to wait for orders. The bridge was crowded and crackling with tension, but after 20 years in the Marines, it was all old stuff to Oberholzer. The hobo, as most of the enlisted men called her, out of earshot of the brass, was at the point of the formation as befitted a virtually indestructible battleship already surfeited with these petty conquests. The rest of the cone was sweeping on ahead in the swift enveloping maneuver which had reduced so many previous planets before they had been able to understand what was happening to them. This time, the planet at the focus of all those shifting conic sections of raw naval power was a place called Calais. It was showing now on a screen that Oberholzer could see, turning as placidly as any planet turned when you were too far away from it to see what guns it might be pointing at you. Lieutenant Campion was watching it too, though he had to look out of the very corners of his eyes to see it at all. If the exec were caught watching the screen instead of the meter board assigned to him, Captain Hammer would probably reduce him to an ensign. Nevertheless, Campion never took his eyes off the image of Calais. This one was going to be rough. Captain Hammer was watching too. After a moment, he said, "Sound!" in a voice like sandpaper. "By the pulse 6, sir," Lieutenant Spring's voice murmured from the direction of the scope. His junior, a very raw youngster named Rover, passed him a chit from the plotting table. "For that read, by the briefs 589, sir," the invisible navigator corrected. Oberholzer listened without moving, while Captain Hammer muttered under his breath to Flomar 12 Upjohn, the only civilian allowed on the bridge, and small wonder, since he was the consort of state of the matriarchy itself. Hammer had long ago become accustomed to his own bridge to be able to control who overheard him, but 12 Upjohn's answering whisper must have been audible to every man there. "The briefing said nothing about a second inhabited planet," the consort said a little peevishly. "But then there's very little we do know about this system. That's part of our trouble. What makes you think it's a colony?" "A colony from Calais, not one of ours," Hammer said in more or less normal tones. Evidently, he had decided against trying to keep only half the discussion private. "The electromagnetic noise from both planets has the same spectrum. The energy level, the output, is higher on Calais, that's all. That means similar machines being used in similar ways. And let me point out, Your Excellency, that the outer planet is in opposition to Calais now, which will put it precisely in our rear if we complete this maneuver." "When we complete this maneuver," 12 Upjohn said firmly, "is there any evidence of communication between the two planets?" Hammer frowned. "No," he admitted. "Then we'll regard the colonization hypothesis as unproved, and stand ready to strike back hard if events prove us wrong. I think we have a sufficient force here to reduce 3 planets like Calais if we're driven to that pitch." Hammer grunted and resigned the argument. Of course, it was quite possible that 12 Upjohn was right. He did not lack for experience. In fact, he wore the silver earring as the most traveled consort of state ever to ride the standing wave. Nevertheless, Oberholzer repressed a sniff with difficulty. Like all the military, he was a colonial. He had never seen the earth and never expected to. And both as a colonial and as a marine who had been fighting the matriarchy's battles all his adult life, he was more than a little contemptuous of Earthmen, with their tandem names and all that they implied. Of course, it was not the consort of state's fault that he had been born on Earth, and so had been named only Marvin 12 out of the misfortune of being male, nor that he had married into Florence Upjohn's cabinet, that being the only way one could become a cabinet member, and Marvin 12 having been taught from birth to believe that such a post was the highest honor a man might covet. All the same, neither 12 Upjohn nor his entourage of drones filled Oberholzer with confidence. Nobody, however, had asked Master Sergeant Richard Oberholzer what he thought, and nobody was likely to. As the chief of all the non Navy enlisted personnel on board the hobo, he was expected to be on the bridge when matters were ripening toward criticality. But his duty there was to listen, not to proffer advice. He could not, in fact, remember any occasion when an officer had asked his opinion, though he had received and executed his fair share of near suicidal orders from bridges long demolished. By the pulse 5.5, Lieutenant Spring's voice sang. Sergeant Oberholzer, Hammer said. Aye, sir. We are proceeding as per orders. You may now brief your men and put them into full battle gear. Oberholzer saluted and went below. There was little enough he could tell the squad. As 12 Upjohn had said, Kali's system was nearly unknown, but even that little would improve the total ignorance in which they had been kept till now. Luckily, they were not much given to asking questions of a strategic sort. Like impressed space hands everywhere, the huge mass of the matriarchy's interstellar holdings meant nothing to them but endlessly riding the standing wave with battle and death lurking at the end of every jump. Luckily, also, they were inclined to trust Oberholzer, if only for the low cunning he had shown in keeping most of them alive, especially in the face of unusually Crimean orders from the bridge. This time, Oberholzer would need every ounce of trust and of obedience they would give him. Though he never expected anything but the worst, he had a queer, cold feeling that this time he was going to get it. There were hardly any data to go on yet, but there had been something about Kali that looked persuasively like the end of the line. Very few of the 40 men in the wardroom even looked up as Oberholzer entered. They were checking their gear in the dismal light of the fluorescents with the single mindedness of men to whom a properly wound gun tube coil, a properly set face shield gasket, a properly fueled and focused vaulting jet had come to mean more than parents, children, retirement pensions, the rule of law, or the logic of empire. The only man to show any flicker of interest was Sergeant Cassirer, as normal, since he was Oberholzer's understudy, and he did no more than look up from over the straps of his anti-gas suit and say, Well, well, Oberholzer said, now hear this. There was a sort of composite jingle and clank as the men lowered their gear to the deck or put it aside on their bunks. We're investing a planet called Kali in the Canes Venatici system, Oberholzer said, sitting down on an olive drab canvas pack stuffed with lysergic acid grenades. A cruiser called the Assam Dragon. You were with her on her shakedown, weren't you, Himber? Touched down here 10 years ago with a flock of tenders and got swallowed up. They got 2 or 3 quick yells for help out, and that was that. Nothing anybody could make much sense of, no weapons named or description of the enemy. So here we are, loaded for the kill. Wasn't any Kaylee in command of the Assam Dragon when I was aboard, Himber said doubtfully. Nah, place was named for the astronomer who spotted her from the rim of the cluster 100 years ago, Oberholzer said. Nobody names planets for ship's captains. Anybody got any sensible questions? Just what kind of trouble are we looking for? Cassirer said. That's just it. We don't know. This is closer to the center of the galaxy than we've ever gotten before. It may be a population center, too. It could be that Kaylee is just one of the piece of a federation, at least inside its own cluster. That's why we've got the boys from Mama on board. This one could be damn important. Somebody sniffed. If this cluster is full of people, how come we never picked up signals from it? How do you know we never did? Oberholzer retorted. For all I know, maybe that's why the Assam Dragon came here in the first place. Anyhow, that's not our problem. All we're. The lights went out. Simultaneously, the whole mass of the Novo Rushington grad shuddered savagely, as though a boulder almost as big as she was had been dropped on her. Seconds later, the gravity went out too. Flomar 12 Upjohn knew no more of the real nature of the disaster than did the wardroom squad, nor did anybody on the bridge, for that matter. The blow had been indetectable until it struck, and then most of the fleet was simply annihilated. Only the hobo was big enough to survive the blow, and she survived only partially, in fact, in 5 pieces. Nor did the consort of state ever know by what miracle the section he was in hit Cayley still partially under power. He was not privy to the self-salvaging engineering principles of battleships. All he knew, once he struggled back to consciousness, was that he was still alive, and that there was a broad shaft of sunlight coming through a top to bottom split in one wall of what had been his office aboard ship. He held his ringing head for a while, then got up in search of water. Nothing came out of the dispenser, so he unstrapped his dispatch case from the underside of his desk and produced a pint palladium flask of vodka. He'd screwed up his face to sample this, at the moment he would have preferred water, when a groan reminded him that there might be more than one room in his suddenly shrunken universe, as well as other survivors. He was right on both counts. Though the ship's section he was in consisted mostly of engines, of whose function he had no notion, there were also three other staterooms. Two of these were deserted, but the third turned out to contain a battered member of his own staff by name Robin One. The young man was not yet conscious, and 12 Upjohn regarded him with a faint touch of despair. Robin One was perhaps the last man in space that the consort of state would have chosen to be shipwrecked with. That he was utterly expendable almost went without saying. He was, after all, a drone. When the perfection of sperm electrophoresis had enabled parents for the first time to predetermine the sex of their children, the predictable result had been an enormous glut of males, which was directly accountable for the present regime on Earth. By the time the people and the lawmakers, thoroughly frightened by the crazy years of fashion upheavals, beefcake, polyandry, male prostitution, and all the rest, had come to their senses, the matriarchy was in to stay. A weak electric current had overturned civilized society as drastically as the steel knife had demoralized the Eskimos. Though the tide of excess males had since receded somewhat, it had left behind a rack of which Robin One was a bubble. He was a drone, and hence superfluous by definition, fit only to be sent colonizing on diplomatic missions or otherwise thrown away. Superfluity alone, of course, could hardly account for his presence on 12 Upjohn's staff. Officially, Robin One was an interpreter. Actually, since nobody could know the language the consort of state might be called upon to understand on this mission, he was a poet, a class of unattached males with special privileges in the matriarchy, particularly if what they wrote was of the middling difficult or Hillier's society sort. Robin One was an eminently typical member of this class, distractible, sulky, jealous, easily wounded, lazy except when writing, and probably, to give him the benefit of the doubt, for 12 Upjohn had no ear for whatever for poetry, only the second worst poet of his generation. It had to be admitted that assigning 12 Upjohn a poet as an interpreter on this mission had not been a wholly bad idea, and if Hildegard Mueller of the Interstellar Understanding Commission had not thought of it, no mere male would have been likely to, least of all Bar Robe 4 Agberg, director of assimilation. The nightmare of finding the whole of the center of the galaxy organized into one vast federation, much older than Earth's, had been troubling the State Department for a long time, at first from purely theoretical considerations. All those heart stars were much older than those in the spiral arms. Besides, where star density in space is so much higher, interstellar travel does not look quite so insuperable an obstacle as it had long had to Earthmen. And later from certain practical signs, of which the obliteration of the Assam dragon and her tenders had been only the most provocative. Getting along with these people on the first contact would be vital, and yet the language barrier might well prove a tragedy wanted by neither side, as the obliteration of Nagasaki in World War II had been provoked by the mistranslation of a single word. Under such circumstances, a man with a feeling for strange words in odd relationships might well prove to be useful, or even vital. Nevertheless, it was with a certain grim enjoyment that 12 Upjohn poured into Robin One a good 2-ounce jolt of vodka. Robin coughed convulsively and sat up blinking. Your Excellency, what's happened? I thought we were dead, but we've got lights again and gravity. He was observant, that had to be granted. The lights are ours, but the gravity is Kali's, 12 Upjohn explained tersely. We're in a part of the ship that cracked up. Well, it's good that we've got power. We can't afford to be philosophical about it. Whatever shape it's in, this derelict is a thoroughly conspicuous object, and we'd better get out of it in a hurry. Why? Robin said. We were supposed to make contact with these people. Why not just sit here until they notice us and come see us? Suppose they just blast us into smaller bits instead. They didn't stop to parley with the fleet, you'll notice. This is a different situation, Robin said stubbornly. I wouldn't have stopped to parley with that fleet myself if I'd had the means of knocking it out first. It didn't look a bit like a diplomatic mission, but why should they be afraid of a piece of a wreck? The consort of state stroked the back of his neck reflectively. The boy had a point. It was risky. On the other hand, how long would they survive foraging in completely unknown territory? And yet, obviously, they couldn't stay cooped up in here forever, especially if it was true that there was already no water. He was spared having to make up his mind by a halloo from the direction of the office. After a startled stare at each other, the two hit the deck running. Sergeant Oberholzer's face was peering grimly through the split in the bulkhead. "Oh," he said, "so you did make it." He said something unintelligible to some invisible person outside, and then squirmed through the breach into the room with considerable difficulty since he was in full battle gear. "None of the officers did, so I guess that puts you in command." "In command of what?" 12 Upjohn said dryly. "Not very much," the Marine admitted. "I've got 5 men surviving, one of them with a broken hip, and a section of the ship with 2 drive units in it. It would lift more or less if we could jury rig some controls, but I don't know where we'd go in it without supplies or a navigator, or an overdrive for that matter." He looked about speculatively. "There was a standing wave transceiver in this section, I think, but it'd be a miracle if it still functioned." "Would you know how to test it?" Robin asked. "No. Anyhow, we've got more immediate business than that. We've picked up a native. What's more, he speaks English. Must have picked it up from the Assam Dragon. We started to ask him questions, but it turns out he's some sort of top official, so we brought him over here on the off chance that one of you was alive." "What a break!" Robin One said explosively. "A whole series of them," 12 Upjohn agreed, none too happily. He had long ago learned to be at his most suspicious when the breaks seemed to be coming his way. "Well, better bring him in." "Can't," Oberholzer said. "Apologies, Your Excellency, but he wouldn't fit. You'll have to come to him." It was impossible to imagine what sort of stock the Kalian had evolved from. He seemed to be a thorough-growing mixture of several different phyla. Most of him was a brown segmented tube about the diameter of a barrel and perhaps 25 feet long, rather like a cross between a python and a worm. The front segments were carried upright, raising the head a good 10 feet off the ground. Properly speaking, 12 Upjohn thought, the Kalian really had no head, but only a front end, marked by 2 enormous faceted eyes and 3 upsetting simple eyes, which were usually closed. Beneath these was a collar of 6 short squid-like tentacles carried wrapped around the creature in a ropey ring. He was as impossible looking as he was fearsome, and 12 Upjohn felt at a multiple disadvantage from the beginning. "How did you learn our language?" he said, purely as a starter. "I learned it from you," the Kalian said promptly. The voice was unexpectedly high, a quality which was accentuated by the creature's sing-song intonation. 12 Upjohn could not see where it was coming from. "From your ship which I took apart, the Dragon of War." "Why did you do that?" "It was evident that you meant me ill," the Kalian sang. "At that time I did not know that you were sick, but that became evident at the dissections." "Dissections? You dissected the crew of the Dragon?" "All but one." There was a growl from Oberholzer. The consort of state shot him a warning glance. "You may have made a mistake," 12 Upjohn said. "A natural mistake, perhaps. But it was our purpose to offer you trade and peaceful relationships. Our weapons were only precautionary." "I do not think so," the Kalian said, "and I never make mistakes. That you make mistakes is natural, but it is not natural to me." 12 Upjohn felt his jaw dropping. That the creature meant what he said could not be doubted. His command of the language was too complete to permit any more sensible interpretation. 12 Upjohn found himself at a loss. Not only was the statement the most staggering he had ever heard from any sentient being, but while it was being made, he had discovered how the Kalians spoke. The sounds issued at low volume from a multitude of spiracles or breath holes all along the body, each hole producing only one pure tone, the words and intonations being formed in mid-air by intermodulation, a miracle of coordination among a multitude of organs obviously unsuited for sound forming at all. This thing was formidable. It would have been evident even without the lesson of the chunk of the Novo Washington grad canted crazily in the sand behind him. Sand? He looked about with a start. Until that moment, the Kalian had so hypnotized his attention that he had forgotten to look at the landscape, but his unconscious had registered it. Sand and nothing but sand. If there were better parts of Kali than this desert, they were not visible from here all the way to the horizon. What do you propose to do with us? He said at last. There was really nothing else to say. Cut off in every possible sense from his home world, he no longer had any base from which to negotiate. Nothing, the Kalian sang. You are free to come and go as you please. You're no longer afraid of us? No. When you came to kill me, I prevented you, but you can no longer do that. There you've made a mistake, all right, Oberholzer said, lifting his rifle toward the multicolored glittering jewels of the Kalian's eyes. You know what this is? They must have had them on the Dragon. Don't be an idiot, Sergeant, 12 Upjohn said sharply. We're in no position to make any threats. Nor, he added silently, should the Marine have called attention to his gun before the Kalian had taken any overt notice of it. I know what that is, the creature said. You cannot kill me with that. You tried it often before and found you could not. You would remember this if you were not sick. I never saw anything I couldn't kill with a Sussman flamer, Oberholzer said between his teeth. Let me try it on the bastard, Your Excellency. Wait a minute, Robin once said, to 12 Upjohn's astonishment. I want to ask some questions, if you don't mind, Your Excellency. I don't mind, 12 Upjohn said after an instant. Anything to get the Marine's crazy impulse towards slaughter sidetracked. Go ahead. Did you dissect the crew of the Assam Dragon personally? Robin asked the Kalian. Of course. Are you the ruler of this planet? Yes. Are you the only person in this system? No. Robin paused and frowned. Then he said, Are you the only person of your species in your system? No, there is another in Xixobrax, the fourth planet. Robin paused once more, but not, it seemed to 12 Upjohn, as though he were in any doubt. It was only as though he were gathering his courage for the key question of all. 12 Upjohn tried to imagine what it might be and failed. How many of you are there? Robin once said. I cannot answer that. As of the instant you asked me that question, there were 83,189,465,180, but now the number has changed and it goes on changing. Impossible, 12 Upjohn said, stunned. Not even two planets could support such a number, and you'd never allow a desert like this to go on existing if you had even a fraction of that population to support. I begin to think, sir, that you are a type normal to my business, the ordinary, unimaginative liar. He's not lying, Robin said, his voice quivering. It all fits together. Just let me finish, sir, please. I'll explain, but I've got to go through to the end first. Well, 12 Upjohn said helplessly, all right, go ahead. But he was instantly sorry, for what Robin once said was, Thank you, I have no more questions. The Kalian turned in a great liquid wheel and poured away over the sand dunes at an incredible speed. 12 Upjohn shouted after him without any clear idea of what it was that he was shouting, but no matter, for the Kalian took no notice. Within seconds, it seemed, he was only a threadworm in the middle distance, and then he was gone. They were all alone in the chill desert air. Oberholzer lowered his rifle bewilderedly. He's fast, he said to nobody in particular. Cripes, but he's fast. I couldn't even keep him in the sights. That proves it, Robin said tightly. He was trembling, but whether with fright or elation, 12 Upjohn could not tell, possibly both. It had better prove something, the consort of state said, trying hard not to sound portentous. There was something about this bright remote desert that made empty any possible pretense of dignity. As far as I see, you've just lost us what may have been our only chance to treat with these creatures, just as surely as if the sergeant would have done with his gun. Explain, please. I didn't really catch on until I realized he was using the second person singular when he spoke to us, Robin said. If he had heard any threat implied in 12 Upjohn's charge, it was not visible. He seemed totally preoccupied. There's no way to tell them apart in modern English. We thought he was referring to us as you plural, but he wasn't any more than his I was a plural. He thinks we're all part of the same personality, including the men from the dragon, too, just as he is himself. That's why he left when I said I had no more questions. He can't comprehend that each of us has an independent ego. For him, such a thing doesn't exist. Like ants, 12 Upjohn said slowly. I don't see how an advanced technology. No, but I do see. And if it's so, it means any Kalian we run across would be their chief of state, but that no one of them actually is. The only other real individual is next door on the fourth planet, another hive ego. Maybe not, Robin said. Don't forget that he thinks we're part of one too. 12 Upjohn dismissed that possibility at once. He's sure to know his own system. After all, what alarms me is the population figure he cites. That's got to be at least cluster wide. And from the exactness with which he was willing to cite it for a given instant, he had to have immediate access to all of it, an instant, effortless census. Yes, said Robin, meaning mind to mind contact from one to all throughout the whole complex. That's what started me thinking about the funny way he used pronouns. If that's the case, Robin, we are spurlos versenkt, and my pronoun includes the earth. They may have some limitations, Robin said, but he was clearly only whistling in the dark. But at least it explains why they butchered the dragon's crew so readily, and why they're willing to let us wander around their planet as if we didn't even exist. We don't, for them. They can't have any respect for an individual life. No wonder they didn't give a damn for the sergeant's gun. His initial flush had given way to a marble paleness. There were beads of sweat on his brow in the dry, hot air, and he was trembling harder than ever. He looked as though he might faint in the next instant, though only the slightest of stutters disturbed his rush of words. But for once, the consort of state could not accuse him of agitation over trifles. Oberholzer looked from one to the other, his expressions betraying perhaps only disgust or perhaps blank incomprehension. It was impossible to tell. Then, with a sudden sharp snick which made them both start, he shot closed the safety catch on the Sussman. Well, he said in a smooth, cold, empty voice, now we know what we'll eat. And we'll follow the adventures of these shipwrecked survivors next time.